What's going on, everybody? It's SJ back with another video to give you my reaction of last night's college football playoff rankings reveal. Obviously, every single time this happens, there's a big storm of complaints, arguments the next day, everything like that. So I'm going to address a lot of the common reactions that I'm seeing, especially involved with my Longhorns, of course, like I'm always going to do, and then my reaction to the rankings, where things stand with everybody. How I kind of feel like everybody's overreacting a little bit, and also just where bias actually lies in these rankings compared to where the narrative is that the bias lies, right? So let's start at the top and start with the Texas Longhorns. Everybody is up in arms about the Longhorns being ranked number 3 and currently would be the 2 seed if the season ended today in the college football playoff rankings. The word is that the Texas Longhorns don't have a good enough resume. They haven't played enough ranked opponents. Their best win is against Vanderbilt. You've heard it all, right? That the resume doesn't stack up with Georgia's and others who they lost to. Therefore, a lot of people, especially Longhorns rivals and other SEC teams, feel like the Longhorns shouldn't be ranked as highly as they were. There was a clip last night, Joey Galloway and Reese Davis, Booger McFarland, of them basically bashing Texas. And I'll send the clip to Pete, see if we can put it in the video here. But
because the SEC is a gauntlet, and it isn't just who you play; it's who you play after you've had to play a Georgia, a Texas, a Alabama, Ole Miss.
It's such a gauntlet. Texas hadn't played anybody.
I've never heard you respect the Big Ten like this, and I appreciate it.
It's such a gauntlet. Texas' best win is Vanderbilt.
That's what I said.
The whole point is because of these expanded conferences, you have to evaluate each team. We shouldn't.
Correct.
We fall into the trap here, and I let you guys fall into the trap. We're just evaluating the SEC teams against each other. The SEC team should be evaluated against Indiana, against Notre Dame, against SMU, against whoever, regardless of what conference they're in. But their strength of schedule, by almost every strength of schedule metric you look at, better. Most of them. Now, Texas is mediocre. You're right. Texas needs to perform. And Indiana, for the people who say that, well, we got to make.
They were bashing Texas. Reese Davis said that Texas hasn't played anybody. Texas is mediocre. Texas needs to perform. That's insane. Booger McFarland took a shot at the schedule. Joey Galloway, the Ohio State spokesman of the group, decided to take his shots like he always does against Texas. And Bob Ballou responded to the tweet, which I'm going to read you here, and I'll try to have it posted on the clip as well. And I think he nailed it on the head. He said, Reese Davis, quote unquote, Texas is mediocre. Texas needs to perform. Booger, Texas hasn't played anybody. And this is what Bob's response to it was. Hoping Reese just meant Texas' schedule is mediocre. Parentheses, I think he did. Close parentheses. But there's an argument to be made both ways here for and against Texas. I agree with that. He said Texas can't do anything about its schedule. We all know that. The SEC scheduled the schedule that it did, and it scheduled Texas to play all 3 of its rivals, none of them at home, by the way. And the Longhorns also went on the road to Michigan, the defending national champions. They also did not play an FCS school, which many others, pretty much the entire SEC does, right? He said to all of those nobodies that they played at Vanderbilt and won, which number 7 Alabama lost to in Nashville. They played at Arkansas and Fayette-Nam and won, which number 11 Tennessee went to and lost to. And this Saturday, they play Kentucky, who number 9 Ole Miss lost to earlier in the season. The good news is for Texas, Bob says, is if Texas beats Kentucky and Texas A&M, it wins the SEC regular season title outright and will play for the conference championship, which pretty much assures your spot in the college football playoffs. I agree with that. I'm going to elaborate on that. And before I elaborate and dive deeper into some of my other points, I want to touch on what he said lastly. First and foremost, when we're having this discussion, everybody needs to tell themselves before they get in an argument, before they throw a fit or do any of that stuff, these college football playoff rankings are not final, and they will not be final until the conference championships are decided. Therefore, everybody can take a deep breath, take a drink of water, and relax. All of these questions that we have, if not every question that we have, is going to be answered on the football field prior to the final college football playoff rankings coming out and that bracket being established. So for all the A&M fans in the world that can't believe the Texas Longhorns ranking, you get to play Texas next week. Handle your business against Auburn, and you get Texas at home on Senior Day in Kyle Field. If you're in the SEC, if you're Alabama, and we went out and we go to the SEC title game, you get your shot at Texas in the SEC title game. And these questions will answer themselves on who is who and who could play who, right? So that whole thing, I feel like, is thrown out of everybody's brain while we're having these arguments. Is that this isn't the final college football playoff ranking, and you can make sense of the way that it is. So who has Texas played? Their key wins are against Arkansas and Vanderbilt. Everybody laughs at the key wins against Arkansas and Vanderbilt. I'm looking at a tweet here from a fellow A&M Twitter guy that I see often, Tim England, and he has all caps, ha, 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 ha. Those are the key wins in all caps, question mark. Well, you got Tennessee and Ole Miss. I mean, not Ole Miss. You got Tennessee and Alabama, who are in the mix of this playoff discussion. If you go look at their Twitters, Tennessee Twitter, Alabama Twitter, they all have things to say. Their key losses are against Arkansas and Vanderbilt. Alabama losing to Vanderbilt, and Tennessee losing to Arkansas. So if those are going to be key wins for Arkansas and Vanderbilt, beating Alabama and Tennessee, or key losses for Alabama and Tennessee when we're having these discussions on can they get into the playoffs, then you can't also bash them for being key wins against Texas. For Texas. Again, Arkansas is a rival that we played on the road that absolutely despises them, right? And then we have common opponents with more than one team. If you look at Arkansas, like I said, Arkansas has played multiple teams that are in this discussion. They beat LSU this past. I mean, they didn't. They lost LSU. Sorry. They've played. I'm looking at LSU's schedule. What happened to Arkansas? Bear with me real quick. Like I said, Arkansas beat Tennessee, so we've already got that out of the way. They played to A&M to the wire, who's coming up on the Longhorn schedule. They arguably should have beat A&M. They also shut down Marcel Reed's legs in that game. And then who else did Arkansas play? They got killed by Ole Miss in a situation where Arkansas's quarterback goes down, right? So you go look at Florida, on the other hand, with Texas, who the week prior to playing Texas played Georgia to the absolute wire. Florida then the week after playing Texas goes and beats LSU, who was squarely in the mix to go to the SEC championship. Our friend Buddha, a part of the First and 12 Ounces podcast, he's an LSU fan. He was talking about all week long, if LSU wins out and all the favorites in the SEC win their games the rest of the way, LSU's in the driver's seat to go to the SEC championship and play Texas or Texas A&M, whoever wins that game, right? So LSU going into the rivalry game against Florida at the Swamp understood the situation that they were in and the really realistic shot that they had not only to get to the college football playoffs, but to compete for the conference championship. Well, Florida goes and handles LSU at the Swamp, and the word is Texas didn't play DJ Lagway, right? So Texas win against Florida, their blowout win does not count because DJ Lagway was out in the game. Well, if you're going by that logic, then Georgia technically lost to Florida because Georgia was losing to Florida when DJ Lagway got hurt, and they were losing for the majority of the game. That was a 4-quarter game, even when the third-string quarterback came in. Georgia couldn't pull away immediately. It took some turnovers. It took some bounces to go Georgia's way at the end of that game to turn it into what it did, right? And then you got Vanderbilt, who beat Alabama. You got Mississippi State, who played a lot better against Georgia than they played against Texas. They've challenged other teams this year. They've had games with 400, close to 500 passing yards. You got Oklahoma, who got in a 4-quarter game against Ole Miss. Nick Saban and others say that Ole Miss is the best team in the SEC right now. Well, Ole Miss almost lost it. They were losing at halftime to Oklahoma. That was a game where a red zone interception from Jackson Arnold, a couple dumbfounding plays in an Oklahoma team that continues to find ways to lose every single week. If they're not a team that does that and always finds a way to lose, maybe they beat Ole Miss. They didn't even score a touchdown against Texas. They moved the ball in the Ole Miss defense the entire game, right? So, common opponents only work in the favor of every team but Texas if it favors you. And if Texas beats them, you find the reasons why the wins are discredited. And yet you turn around and give teams like Georgia, Ohio State, teams around the country the benefit of the doubt in their situations. So the one thing I would ask you, if you're not a Longhorns fan or if you're in the national media, if you're Reese Davis or whoever you are, is to be consistent with your criticism across the country. Because every single thing you say about Texas, you can say about pretty much every other team in the top 12. Every single thing that you're going to discredit, whether it's quarterback play or offense, I can go around the country and look at bad quarterback play. Oregon didn't light up the field last week in Camp Randall with their quarterback, right? So the Longhorns are laughed at for their key wins, and yet the teams that they beat are key losses to some of the best teams in the country. And then there's the Georgia game, right? The first half drive chart of that Georgia game really tells the story of the entire game. The reason Texas lost this game was because of these 4 drives, and it's really just because of the second quarter meltdown. The first quarter ended with 6 seconds left to go in the first quarter. Georgia scored their first touchdown of the game off of a Longhorns turnover, right? It was 4 plays for 13 yards, and they scored a touchdown. The next drive, Georgia takes over on the 33-yard line. They have 7 plays for 13 yards and get a field goal. Georgia gets the ball back, 3 plays, 34 yards, and a touchdown. Or no, another field goal, right? So they're up 17-10 at this point. And then Georgia has another drive where they go 7 plays, 25 yards, and get another field goal. They're up 20-0. Georgia's last drive of the first half, 4 plays, 4 total yards, another field goal. So their first 23 points of the game, only on 1 drive did they amass more than 25 yards to get 23 points. Texas gift-wrapped Georgia 4 consecutive drives on the 35-yard line or better. 2 of those were because of turnovers, and 2 of those were because really bad punts by the Texas Longhorns backup punter. The Longhorns outplayed Georgia from the second quarter on. For the third quarter on. They outscored them in the second half. They made it a 1-score game in the fourth quarter, had Georgia backed up on a third down, where they were able to execute, drive down the field, and seal the game up with a touchdown. That's fine. But the narrative is that Georgia walked into Austin and stopped Texas. That just did not happen. The Georgia offensive output, they had under 200 passing yards, 175 in total, and 3 interceptions. No passing touchdowns. The running backs had 110 yards. An all right game. Nothing to write home about at all, especially given the turnovers that they got, where they got them. It wasn't a Georgia drumming like everyone wants to act like. This was not the situation of Georgia versus Clemson. Okay? It wasn't even Georgia versus Tennessee. Reality is they got gift-wrapped 23 points from the field position they were given. They won the field position battle, which won them the game. If Texas were to rematch Georgia, not only can they beat Georgia, they will beat Georgia. They play a clean game. They don't just beat Georgia. They beat Georgia by more than 10 points. I will argue that with anybody. I've watched the game as many times as anybody else has. I've watched both teams play every single week this season, understanding that's who we were in the race with. And then lastly, there's the looming Texas A&M game. How much of all of this so-called chaos in the college football playoffs comes down to, and the controversy that people are expecting to happen with the final rankings, how much of it comes down to A&M needing to beat Texas? I think a lot of it does, especially in the SEC, because the reality is, if and when Texas wins out and goes on and wins the SEC championship, a lot of this stuff's a moot point. A&M's going to be out, LSU's going to be out. One team between Georgia or Alabama is going to probably be left out, and that could spell some controversy because Georgia came and beat Texas. They beat Texas by 15 points. All right, they didn't beat Texas by 50. They beat them by 15. It was a 1-score game in the fourth quarter. There's circumstances and context that needs to be discussed. They've also struggled against Kentucky. Texas plays them this week. We'll see how that goes. They struggled against Florida. Texas blew Florida out of the water. They're in a 1-possession game with the Tennessee team or whatever it was. I think it might have ended in 2 possessions. I stopped watching the game. This isn't a fact-checking podcast. Never will be. Never has been. But nonetheless, for everything that you could say, you could look at everybody's schedule, you could critique it, and you could say you could have done better here. I understand Georgia has easily the best strength of schedule of anybody in this discussion, if not the entire country as a whole. And yet they got by a lot of years on a very weak strength of schedule. And what goes around comes around. You knew your schedule coming in. It played out the way that it did. Carson Beck has 14 interceptions or whatever he has. That's why you're in the position that you're in, and you don't control your own destiny. You need to focus on beating Georgia Tech, because the way Georgia's played all year long, they're liable to go out and struggle against a rival in Georgia Tech here in 2 weeks. Handle the business that you handle and understand the rest plays out. If Texas goes and blows out Alabama, you might get in. Who knows? Nonetheless, I think a lot of these answers will answer themselves, and so much of this depends on A&M beating Texas, which will not happen. Styles make fights, and Texas is going to kill A&M. Texas completely stifles dual threat quarterbacks. They'll take Marcel Reed's legs away from him, and I don't think anybody in the world thinks that that's a guy that can beat Texas through the air, or that the A&M Colin Klein offense can beat Texas through a passing attack. Let me read you some Texas defensive stats. Texas defensive team grade, 92.7, second in the country. Texas coverage grade, 93.3, number one in the nation. That's why I said what I just said. Texas pass rush grade, 82.7, that's eighth in the country. Their stop rate, 87.1, first in the country. Scoring defense, fourth in the country, allowing an average of 11.9 points per game. Texas has a touchdown to interception ratio on defense that is 1-5. For every touchdown that is scored by an opposing team through the air against Texas, the University of Texas has 5 interceptions before that happens. That is unbelievable. This is the best defense in program history. Total defense, they're third in America. Third down defense, they're eighth in the country. Tackle for loss, they're 12th in the country. Their safety unit's considered to be the best in America. Anthony Hill Jr. might be the best middle linebacker in the country, if not the best defensive player in the country. With everything that he can do, Colin Simmons is going to be a freshman All-American easily. 2 sacks last week. Seems like every week he's having a multiple sack week, or at least coming very close. Reading all these stats to you, it screams Texas is going to walk into Kyle Field and handle that A&M team. Let's not get too much into the hoopla, into the renewal of the rivalry. Texas is a better team than Texas A&M, and they're going to show it here in a week's time when that game is played. They're better than Kentucky, and they're going to show that. They're going to handle Kentucky in a way that Georgia could not, that Ole Miss didn't. All right? So you're going to have the common opponent victories against other teams like Alabama, Ole Miss, Georgia. If we are to play an Ole Miss and beat them, Texas will have common opponents with everybody. Michigan still has Ohio State on deck. They're going to play that game. They're going to keep scoring that game. We'll see what happens, right? And that takes me to the next point, my final point. There is a bias in these college football playoff rankings, right? But it doesn't exist in the SEC. It exists in the Big Ten. The top 5 has 4 Big Ten teams in it, including Penn State, right? Let me get to my notes on Penn State real quick. And Ohio State, really. So let's talk about the Big Ten favoritism versus SEC favoritism. Who has Ohio State beat? Why is their resume the way it is? Penn State is Ohio State's best victory. Ohio State beat Penn State by 6 points, right? Penn State is 1-13 versus top 10 teams since 2016. 1-13 since 2016 against top 10 opponents. Penn State is 12-25 versus the top 25 under James Franklin. And that's Ohio State's best victory. They lost their one test against Oregon. So if you're going to bash Texas for losing their one test against Georgia, Ohio State lost their one test against Oregon, right? Indiana's schedule is awful because the Big Ten Conference is overrated. The SEC top to bottom is just significantly better than the Big Ten, and there's no question about it. There is a gigantic difference in a Northwestern and an Arkansas or a Vanderbilt or even a Mississippi State. All right. Northwestern, who played Ohio State this weekend, and the score doesn't tell the story. At the end of the first half, they were leading in every single statistical category but the scoreboard, right? Well, Ohio State, multiple games this year, if you're watching the games be played out, which you hope the College Football Playoff Committee's doing, right? Like, they're not just stat watching, they're not just scoreboard watching, they're actually watching the games and receiving context of how this happens. There's multiple games this year where the score doesn't really tell the story on an Ohio State game. Right? They struggled against Nebraska, who Indiana absolutely dominated start to finish. They struggled against Northwestern for a half this past week. They struggled against Penn State in a close game, and they lost to Oregon. So they get the benefit of the doubt, but it's crazy for the University of Texas to get the benefit of the doubt. Penn State gets the benefit of the doubt. They're 1-13 versus top 10 opponents since 2016. They didn't beat the one test that they had this year. Penn State almost lost to Bowling Green. They almost lost to a bad USC team that lost to Michigan, who Texas beat, right? But they get the benefit of the doubt. They're the number 5 team. They have nobody else to test them from now to the college football playoffs. They have an automatic bid, is what you're telling us, based off of a weak schedule and a conference that's getting favoritism over other conferences. The Big Ten does not deserve favoritism this year. They don't. It's a 2-team race for the conference, and really a 2-team race for a chance to win a national championship. Nobody in the world thinks Penn State's going to win a playoff game against a team that has a pulse. They haven't beat a team with a pulse since 2016. They have a losing record against ranked opponents since 2016, since James Franklin's been there. Penn State beats up on bad teams, but Texas is the overrated team that doesn't deserve a spot in the playoffs if they lose to A&M. You know? Big Ten teams get a slap on the wrist for close calls like Oregon at Wisconsin, Penn State Bowling Green, Penn State USC, Ohio State Nebraska, Ohio State Penn State, Ohio State struggling against a Northwestern team. They get a slap on the wrist, but Texas and SEC teams get crucified for 10-point wins on the road in an environment like Arkansas. That's where your SEC bias lies. And that's what I have to say about all of this. At the end of the day, a lot of this is going to get settled onto the field. This isn't going to be settled by Joey Galloway or Reese Davis. It's not going to be settled by podcasters like myself. It's not going to be settled on paper, right? It's going to be settled on the field. We should have our answers sooner rather than later on who should be in the college football playoffs. Get your popcorn ready. Enjoy the program. This is more excitement at this time of the year for more teams than there ever has been before. There's legitimately 15 to 20 teams that think they got a shot to play playoff college football, and that's something to be excited about. That's something to be grateful for. So just tune in. Watch the show, watch it play out. We keep scoring these games. We'll have our answers sooner than later. We'll have our conference champions. We'll have our seeding ranked. And I think outside of one team, 1 to 2 teams, the majority of the country is going to agree on the final college football playoff rankings. And more expansion is coming in the years to come anyways. That's what I have to say about last night's rankings. I love you guys more than you know. Not as much as you think. God bless. Have a good day.